Welcome, my dear viewers, to this first in Karama's two-part series on the efforts of COVID-19 on persons held in detention. These two interviews are part of a larger Karama series entitled Towards a More Perfect Union, Civil Rights in the Time of the Pandemic. Today, we will focus on structural issues built into the US justice system that lead to a disparate impact on communities of color, with an emphasis on how COVID-19 is affecting the US's enormous population of incarcerated persons. Next week's interview will focus on how COVID-19 is affecting immigrants held in detention. Our speaker today is Mary Catherine Roper, Esquire. Like me, Ms. Roper is a graduate of the Law School of the University of Philadelphia, class of '93. She has a long list of accomplishments, publications, and honors to her name. But for our purposes today, the most important thing you need to know is that since 2015, Ms. Roper has been the Deputy Legal Director at the ACLU of Pennsylvania, where she coordinates litigation on a broad range of civil liberties issues, including freedom of speech, religious liberty, racial and ethnic justice, student rights, privacy, prisoners' rights, and police misconduct in Pennsylvania. Welcome, Mary Catherine, and thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I'm really honored to be here with you.
Before we dive into the weeds, could you please describe for our audience the many levels of jails, prisons, and detention centers in the US? And also, what authority is responsible for each type of custodial situation? Also, if you could give us some figures for the number of people currently incarcerated in the US, excluding immigrants held in detention, and including any additional statistical information that you think is relevant to help our audience to understand the big picture.
I will do that, and it is a very big picture. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have only 4% of the world's population, but 21% of the world's incarcerated people. And since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 700%. I looked for sort of the most authoritative statistics on this, and those are those put out by the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice. The last available statistics showed a total of just shy of 2.2 million Americans sitting in jails and prisons, plus another perhaps 50,000 or so in immigration detention. You will hear me throughout use two different terms, jails and prisons. Prisons are run by the federal authorities or by state level authorities. State prisons hold people with longer sentences. In Pennsylvania, it's sentences of more than 2 years. You go to the state institution rather than going to a jail, which is run by the county. The latest Department of Justice figures show just over 1.5 million people sitting in state and federal prisons. Jails, as I said, are run by the counties. There are approximately 740,000 people in jail on any given day. And the most important thing to understand is that most of them are not there serving a sentence. About 2/3 of them are there waiting for their trials in criminal cases. They are unable to post bail, which means they are presumed innocent, have not been convicted. The remainder are there on either charge that they have violated probation or parole, on very minor crimes, or even on failure to pay something like child support or even traffic tickets. All of those people are in county jails. Our jails are, no one will be surprised to learn, quite disproportionately populated by African Americans and other people of color. And that is a direct result of the entire chain of our criminal justice system and its targeting of people of color, whether it's starting with the so-called school to prison pipeline, going on to, police stops and frisks. Prosecutorial decisions are different depending on the race of the defendant. There's just evidence of that kind of disparate decision made at every single stage of the criminal justice system, which is why, as a result, our population, our jail and prison populations are disproportionately people of color.
Mary Catherine, I just was wondering, is there any limit to how long a person can be held in pretrial detention?
There are limits. There are the United States Constitution and most state constitutions guarantee someone a speedy trial and speedy progress toward a trial. The word speedy there
term of art.
Yes, should not be considered in any kind of normal sense. We're not talking weeks. Often we are talking more than a year while people wait for trial. Some of that is a function of sort of the slow motion of the criminal justice system. Quite often it is a function of overworked defense attorneys needing more time to prepare their cases. But as a result, there are many people who sit in jail or give up and just take a plea bargain just to get out of jail because they're looking at losing a year of their lives, a year away from their families, a year away from their jobs. Even a very short stay in jail, a few days, people lose their jobs, lose their homes, sometimes lose custody of their children.
Huh. So, and although we're not going to be focusing too much on that on this talk, just roughly in a big urban area, how many of the people who end up in some kind of jail are actually homeless people who've, I mean, in a sense, we have no place to house them. They get picked up for vagrancy or other things and get shoved. At least it gives them a roof over their heads. Not that that's much of a roof.
No one is safer in jail than they are out on the street. And
Wow.
That is true always. It is especially true now, of course, the subject of this meeting. But jails are always full of the people that we have not chosen, who have problems that we have not chosen to address through social services. Jails are very often full of people who are unemployed, homeless, who suffer from mental illness, and disproportionately, they are poor people. Those are the people who do not have resources to address their problems, whether it's substance abuse, mental health, etc.
Affordable housing.
Affordable housing. We criminalize poverty. We criminalize drug addiction. We criminalize mental health challenges in this country throughout our system.
Oof. Well, that's depressing, but thank you for the detailed overview. So if you would, let's now zoom in, to an interview of how the structural imperatives that you've described are playing out in Pennsylvania and what that implies for the size of the incarcerated population in Pennsylvania. And in particular, tell us how COVID-19 is affecting prisoners, and let's not forget the staff in Pennsylvania, and what's being done to ameliorate the situation.
Well, I'd like to start by painting a picture. I'm afraid that when I talk about the criminal justice system, I almost always have to start with, I know you saw this on TV, and that's not really what it's like. So if your idea of what a correctional institution is like comes from Orange is the New Black, I need to reorient you. Prisons and jails are dirty, chaotic places with minimal medical facilities, if any. They have peeling paint, broken toilets, dirt and grime, lack of privacy. What medical care there is provided by contractors who make their money by, spending less than they get paid by the jail authority. And let me also, again, I told you I'm going to keep distinguishing between jails and prisons. I don't mean to suggest that prisons and jails are equivalent in this sense. They are both dirty, chaotic, overcrowded places, but jails are far worse. Your county jail, where you could be sitting just because you haven't gotten to trial yet, or because you're too poor to pay your traffic tickets, or because you have a sentence for a minor crime. Those are the most dirty, under-resourced, and unprofessional places that you could find yourself spending a year or two. And they have many of them have far less medical staff than the state institutions. So our people who have sort of the least due process up to that point, and who have the least serious charges and so on, that is who is in the worst possible place. But whichever of these kinds of institutions you're talking about, social distancing to flatten the curve is simply not feasible, particularly in jails, but also in many prisons. The vast majority of people are housed 2 to a cell or more, 3 or 4 people to a cell. Quite often, the institution requires them to purchase their own soap, and does not, or even if they don't require them to purchase it, they don't readily replace it when it runs out. You have no privacy, no room in that cell you share with 1 or more people. You are living, you are changing, you are coughing, you are sneezing, you are using the toilet, and washing your hands as best you can. Meals, under usual circumstances, are held in congregate settings. These days, most jails and prisons are under lockdown to reduce the amount of congregating that folks are doing, but you still have like 1 correctional officer, right, bringing meals room to room, and therefore, touching and certainly not disinfecting between each cell, right? I mean, it's a constant interaction.
Sounds like one big petri dish.
It is one big petri dish. In prisons in particular, many of the prisoners are older because they are there on longer sentences. Many of them are there on incredibly long sentences from our war on drugs. And they very commonly suffer from hypertension, diabetes, obesity, other ailments that we know make them more susceptible to COVID-19. In Pennsylvania, the first prison inmate to die of COVID-19 was a client of the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project takes on people who claim they have been wrongly convicted and seeks to exonerate them. That takes a very long process. This man had been in jail for 30 years for a crime he did not commit. 3 days after his death, there was a favorable court ruling.
A little bit late.
But that came too late for him, right? And he was one of these people who had contributing health challenges of hypertensive cardiovascular disease. So the ACLU teamed up with medical researchers and published a report that uses epidemiological modeling and concludes that unless there is sort of radical restructuring in our jails and institutions, we are likely to see much higher death toll from the virus, perhaps as much as 100,000 greater than the estimates coming out of our federal government, because the federal estimates are based on assumptions that people are social distancing, but you can't socially distance in jails. Those are not just going to be deaths within the institutions. Those are going to be deaths in the community as well. And again, let me focus on jails. Jails are a real center of this. Jails are a revolving door. You have people who are arrested, incarcerated for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. They make bail, or they enter a plea bargain, or their charges are dropped. So they're in, they're out. An average jail stay across the nation is 25 days. So you have constant flow of people in and out of these facilities. And of course, you have staff who on a daily basis walk into this petri dish and then walk back out and go home to their communities. And by the way, correctional security and other functions in correctional institutions are not highly prized jobs. Those are jobs that are quite often done by people who, at least in urban settings, are people of color, and by people who are poor. They aren't well paid. Sometimes they have additional jobs, right, to try to make ends meet. So once again, the people most at risk are the poorest members of our community, and quite often people of color.
Are correctional officers issued with any kind of protective equipment, or is that not even considered?
It depends on which institution you're talking about. And the reports we have heard from our clients, because we are trying to sue over some of these conditions in jails in Pennsylvania, is that guards either quite often don't use the gloves and masks, or they may use them improperly. They may, in many institutions, they probably don't have enough of them, so that they're using the same, and certainly they're not changing gloves between cells as they go cell to cell. It just as it would be extraordinary to try to maintain correct best practices of hygiene in these circumstances. And honestly, quite a few of these institutions are nowhere near supplied with that. I'm just going to drop another figure on you here. There are some 400,000 people in our country who work in jails and prisons.
Oh my God, that's over and above the prison population. So you're talking.
No, the prison population is 2.2 million, but 400,000 people work in jails and prisons. They're going into these petri dishes and coming out of them every day and going home to their communities.
So that's 2.5 million people roughly, between the inmates and the guards and the other staff, who are circulating through this petri dish on a daily basis. Ew. Ugh.
Ew is one way to put it.
Really makes my skin creep to think about it.
And most jails are doing very little testing. One county jail here, just outside Philadelphia, Montgomery County, decided to test all of its inmates. And that was nearly 1,000 people. And they found 177 positives, approximately 18%, the vast majority of them asymptomatic. So they would never have been tested under the rules, the guidelines or the rules that most of these institutions have in place. Most of these institutions are reporting very, very small rates of infection. It's because they're not testing.
Yeah. Did they test the correctional officers and staff at the same time? Because I'm wondering if you've got 18% confirmed cases among the inmates, I just wonder what that translates into in terms of, correctional officers.
Yeah, the results.
Infected.
The results among correctional officers was not reported. So there certainly have been correctional officers who have become sick with COVID. In Philadelphia last week, we lost our first correctional officer to COVID-19. This is everything you could expect and everything that epidemiological study predicts is starting to roll out. And the problem is that there are some efforts in states and localities to reduce the populations of these facilities by releasing people who are who only say can't post bail, or people who are, say, weeks or months shy of their release date anyway, or perhaps some older prisoners, older people, or people who have health conditions that put them more at risk, may even get furloughed, like go home now, come back when it's done. But those numbers are pretty small.
So just little nibbles around the edges of the problem.
In many places. And then we have sort of a perverse thing happening. The Allegheny County Jail in Pennsylvania has made a serious reduction in the number of inmates. I think in excess of 30%, near 40%. The problem is they then reduced their staff and shut down a wing and crowded everybody into the remaining spaces instead of using the extra space
to spread people out.
So there's it's really hard to understand that kind of a reaction.
No doubt. That is very strange. Now, what prompted the Allegheny County Prison to try to reduce the number of inmates? Was it out of the goodness of their hearts, or were they being kicked?
From the beginning of this pandemic, advocates have been raising their voices, and I include ACLUs and legal organizations, but also organizations that work to counter mass incarceration every day, but now are, of course, focused on the incredible risk that this is. There's been a tremendous push, a tremendous amount of lobbying, quite a few lawsuits filed around the country. And as a result, many court systems, in many places, you have public officials doing what they can, or at least making some efforts. So in many counties all over the nation, you have the district attorney, the public defender, the probation office getting together and making lists of people they think they could let out, perhaps even on house arrest and things like that, and making a lot of progress. That's how the kind of reduction that is we see in Allegheny County and many other counties. That's how it happens, is that the local decision makers get together and say, like, we're going to put together a list, we're going to take some names to the judges and ask them to order these people released. There are other places where the local officials have been less engaged or just flat out uninterested in that kind of a process. So that's the difference, whether the decision makers in the criminal justice system, which are your district attorney, probation, the judges, are willing to move on this or not. Of course, public defenders and defense lawyers all over the country are filing petitions, let our people out, reduce the bail, early parole, anything that they can do to try to get people out. Because, particularly if you're sitting in a county jail on a shoplifting charge, that should not be a death sentence.
Indeed not.
I mean, none of these people should have death by neglect in this completely foreseeable crisis.
And how about the inflow into the system? Is there any attempt at this point by local authorities to go easy on shoving people into the system? I mean, I can see why there might be resistance to letting people out who've been adjudicated. But on the front end of this process, is there any effort to reduce the inflow?
There certainly has been, especially with respect to pretrial detention. And to translate that, that means judges are setting lower bails in many places, not all of them. Again, we have, it depends in part on what's the stance of the local district attorney, and also just what's the stance of the local judiciary, whether they feel any responsibility to try to mitigate the risk, not only to that person you're putting in, but the risk that that person poses to the folks who are already in that facility. Because again, we are finding the vast majority of people who are infected are asymptomatic. We have no idea.
And there's no testing, so we don't know anyway.
There's very little testing.
Oh
right.
My God.
So, unfortunately, as we were discussing before the call, the most productive efforts have been these ones where the local officials take initiative. ACLU and other groups have brought lawsuits to try to get people released, whether from jails or from other institutions. And those lawsuits haven't, by and large, resulted in a whole lot of release, unfortunately.
Has it at least focused the attention of the media somewhat on what's going on, or is this an issue that's also being ignored by the media?
It really depends on where you are. Certainly, there are more and more stories cropping up about what is happening in jails. I would say, that very dramatic move by Montgomery County to test all of its inmates and publish the results, I think was a real eye-opener and helps to move the conversation. That kind of information needs to get out to people.
Wow. Whew, that's a lot to absorb. So for people who, like the two of us, I think, share the view that, one should not be essentially, subjected to a life sentence simply because one failed to make bail and is sitting in some kind of a local jail. Where can people go to get more information on these issues? And if they do want to become more actively involved in this current push to reduce the prison population for ethical and public health reasons, what's the best thing that they can do, in your opinion?
Well, certainly the first thing to do is get informed about what is going on in your area. An excellent place for that is the Prison Policy Initiative at prisonpolicy.org. They are tabulating the efforts at reducing populations in jails and prisons all across the country. So you can go there. You can, honestly, quite a few of the ACLUs, almost every state has a state level ACLU office. So we are ACLU of Pennsylvania. You could go to ACLU of Ohio, ACLU of Wyoming. And there's information there, but the one place that I know is that collecting it all is prisonpolicy.org. So the first thing to do is find out, are your county officials doing a good job of reducing jail population, but your state officials are really not letting people out of state institutions, even those who are old and perhaps near the end of their sentences? And I will tell you, there's far less movement on the state level than there is on the county levels, in part because those are the people who are actually serving sentences and serving for more serious crimes. But you know, for folks who have already satisfied their minimum sentences, the idea that you can't let them out even temporarily under house arrest, under supervision by probation officers, whatever, is again converting any kind of sentence, quite possibly into a death sentence. So first thing, get yourself informed about what's happening locally. Secondly, understand who the decision makers are for your governors, judges, prosecutors, police chiefs. These all have some power to affect the population in these institutions. And I'm just going to repeat district attorneys. District attorneys. And the reason is that your district attorney is elected. You may not have paid attention to your district attorney elections, but they are elected officials, and they are therefore susceptible to local community pressure. And you know, if you contact your district attorney and say, I want to know why you aren't doing more to get people out of our county jail, and I'm going to remember your answer when it comes time for your reelection, and particularly if you can amplify that, of course, by organizing folks through your mosque, organizing folks through your neighborhoods, your other affinity groups. District attorneys are very sensitive. Getting to your local press, they're very sensitive to bad press. And they are key decision makers when it comes to both who goes into a county jail, because they often are asking for high bail. And they're very powerful in terms of who comes out from a county jail. Whether or not they agree with a petition to lower somebody's bail or release somebody on early parole or something like that is going to have a big influence on how the local judges approach that question. Your county executives are the folks who actually operate the county prisons. They are people to lobby for better practices, more distancing, get people out of these multiple folks in one cell, make sure that corrections officers have and are using the personal protective equipment, address the lack of medical care, make sure that there's quick response to anybody getting ill. Those are all things you would pressure your county executives about. In terms of your state prisons, governors have extraordinary power. Governors, in most states, the state constitution gives the governor a power of reprieve, which is to suspend any punishment that someone has been sentenced to temporarily. Governors literally can say, these people in this prison can go home for the next couple of months. They're going to be on house arrest. They're going to be supervised. They'll come back. I'm just suspending their sentence. And in fact, quite a few governors have issued reprieve orders saying they are going to be considering folks for this process very few of those governors have then actually ordered the release of people. Unfortunately, they've established a process, but very few people are getting through it. That is something, again, to put pressure on.
I sometimes wonder, given how fast this bastard virus is spreading, even somebody who was motivated to go through a process expeditiously with the speed with which this coronavirus is spreading. I mean, even waiting a week or two to get through some kind of a review process could be too late for people who are jammed into these institutions.
You know, I'm just going to repeat, you are safer out of these institutions than you are in these institutions. If you are already infected, you're going to get much better medical care out of these institutions than you will inside these institutions. Any day you can walk out is better than a day you were staying in, and can make the difference in terms of whether you live or die. Yes, there's going to be huge rates of infection, no matter what, and those are going to grow day by day. But getting people out still is going to matter. It's going to be the difference between life and death for many of them.
And what about the public health argument that, to the extent that unfortunately these congregate settings have very high rates of infection already in there, letting these people out into the general population, especially given that we're not testing, is actually endangering the wider community?
Well, apart from the moral bankruptcy of that kind of an argument, just because people are already exposed doesn't mean you should lock the gate and leave them there to die. But more importantly, if they are out in the community, that doesn't mean they're wandering around the community. It means they are, again, as in most places, subject to a stay-at-home order. They could be subject to house arrest. They'll be under supervision, and they can be monitored to make sure that they are following good practices like staying inside, wearing a mask, and also you can get them medical care. So, it's it doesn't have to be a risk to the general population. And, we've got large rates of infection in our general population also.
Without any help from...
So the idea that you're going to, flatten the curve by just letting all the people behind bars die, I think is not, and again, the more people who are sick in these institutions, the more risk there is to those 400,000 staff members who are coming in and out. And again, like in jails, people are coming out anyway.
Yes. They
post bail, they finish their sentence. It was a brief sentence. They plead to probation. Jails are revolving doors. You can't simply lock the door and throw away the key.
And think that you've managed to contain it, because you haven't.
No, that will not solve this problem.
Well, that was an eye-opener and no mistake.
I'm sorry that it was, I'm sorry.
I feel like I got a black eye.
I'm sorry it is such a grim picture. Unfortunately, it really is. And these are the people that most of us would forget. If you don't have a family member, if you don't have a loved one in this situation, you don't necessarily have reason to read. You may skip over that particular news story. What I'm begging you is don't, because it's not just them, it's all of us.
Yes, because we are all connected. You can't just assume that somebody you don't know is not going to somehow be able to reach out and touch you.
Right.
It may go through a few more links, but eventually these forgotten peoples, what happens to them is going to affect us all.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you'll be back next week to talk about the plight of immigrants in detention. I hope everybody has a good week, because there's going to be more doom and gloom coming up, delivered by Mary Catherine next week. So I'll thank you again for this horrifying but enlightening talk. And I thank our audience for listening. For those of you who are interested in learning more about these issues, Ms. Roper has given you the link to the Prison Policy Initiative. That's www.prisonpolicy.org. And some of you have seen and downloaded and read the report that we attached to the flyer when we advertised this talk. So there really is a lot that you can do, and we should be thinking in this month of Ramadan about all these people who should not be placed in mortal danger simply because they were homeless, had a drug problem, or for some other reason that they really don't deserve to be left to die. So we will meet again next week, inshallah. Until then, please continue to take all reasonable precautions to stay safe in this time of the pandemic. Thank you so much, Mary Catherine. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye all.